The controversial part of this documentary, which is provoking some MPs to call for heads to roll today at the BBC. Here is the clip in question.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell.
Well, the House of Commons Culture, Media and Sport Committee has now written to the BBC chair, Sir Samir Shah, to ask what action is being taken over the concerns raised in that memo. The memo, incidentally, was written by Michael Prescott, a former external advisor to a BBC committee which reports on standards in the organisation. Michael Prescott, we now understand, is scheduled to give evidence to that Commons committee next week. What does all of this mean for the BBC? What does it say to you about the culture of news within the BBC and whether you can trust this organisation to report on big stories? And that was a massively big story, of course, the impending return of Donald Trump to the White House. We'll take your calls as well, of course. 03030 80 55 55. Just have a chat with one of our team and we'll get you on air as quickly as we can. You can text 81771 and we're joined by Peter Cardwell, TalkTV presenter and chief political commentator for TalkTV. Roger Mosey is a former head of BBC Television News. Roger Bolton is a former editor and a former presenter at the BBC. He's now the host of the podcast Beeb Watch. And Jonathan Sacerdoti is a writer from the Spectator magazine. Welcome to all of you. Glad to have you with us. Peter, I get the impression you're in prosecutor mode already. I've seen what you've been saying about this on Talk TV. Take it away. What is the case the BBC needs to respond to today?
So the clip you played there is spliced together by the look of things. What happens is that Trump says we're going down to Congress. And then about an hour later, he says we fight like hell. And that appears to have been put together by Panorama and then broadcast. Now, I know you know, William, but I just want your listeners to know the perspective I'm coming from on this. I got great opportunities at the BBC. My first job was with Newsnight. I worked with Jeremy Paxman, who I think was one of the best journalists in the country, alive today, I think. He was fantastic. I have a lot of affection for the BBC. But the only thing the BBC has, well, two things that it has that, you know, some person in a cupboard in their kitchen on YouTube doesn't have are resources and trust. And trust has to be absolutely held so incredibly close. Politically, the BBC is at the last chance saloon here. Trust is gone. There are no number of glossy trails by Clive Murray that are broadcast between programmes that are going to convince people that the BBC's journalism on Trump on this particular issue. I'm no great fan of Donald Trump, but what they broadcast, what they appeared to have broadcast, was not true. There was a 19-page document here. It was given to Deborah Turness, who's the head of BBC News. It was given to the chairman of the BBC. It was ignored, and that's why it has been leaked. So time and time again, when these scandals are up, when Hugh Edwards comes up, or whatever scandal the BBC is dealing with that week, we hear lessons will be learned, things will be done, the culture will change. The fact is, in this 19-page document, it's not just the Trump thing. I'm sure you're going to talk about the fact that there's a lot of allegations of bias in regard to Israel and the Middle East, BBC Arabic broadcasting things that aren't true or are straightforwardly anti-Semitic. And the point is that if we can't trust the BBC, which we have to pay for if we want to access it through the licence fee, who can we trust? I want the BBC to succeed, but if they want their charter to be renewed in 2027, if they want the culture secretary to say, yes, you're a unique thing in a very, very, very changing atmosphere, Reform UK may well take power, you know, what has happened, I see this time and time again, the BBC has aligned itself closely with the left, with anti-Israel, anti-Trump brigade. It's going to backfire. It is backfiring in spectacular fashion. It needs to be impartial. Some of it is. There are brilliant people who work for the BBC. Many of them at BBC Northern Ireland have a lot of time for a lot of people who work for the BBC. But the problem is, the overarching problem is that there is bias there. It needs to be acknowledged. It's not acknowledged. This report was put in a drawer and forgotten about.
Okay.
It's come into the public domain. Now questions are being asked. There needs to be a fundamental culture change. And until that happens, people will be sceptical and not trust the BBC.
Let's do this incrementally. I want to walk through some of this. Thank you for that, Peter, for laying that out for us. But Roger Mosey, let me come to you first. Before we turn to what Panorama did in this film and whether that was acceptable, what they did, can we talk first of all about who Michael Prescott is, the committee on editorial standards that he was part of advising the BBC. He wasn't employed by the BBC. He was an external advisor who was party to conversations within the BBC. And I have a quote here from the statement from the BBC itself, which says, while we don't comment on leaked documents, when the BBC receives feedback, it takes it seriously and it considers it carefully. Michael Prescott is a former advisor to a board committee where differing views and opinions of our coverage are routinely discussed and debated. I went onto the BBC website today, Roger, and had a look at the minutes of this particular committee. They're there. You can go and have a look at them. They don't tell you very much about who said what in a particular meeting, but you will find reference to reports from the senior editorial advisor in the BBC, who is a BBC employee, discussing Gaza and the Arabic channel, etc. So there are references in the recent minutes about this. Can you set that in some context for us? Who's Michael Prescott? What's the significance of this quote-unquote report, if it is a report?
Well, the BBC has a number of committees and a number of processes, and it sometimes brings in people from outside to give that as much validity as it can. Now, I think the important thing here, William, is that the BBC should be telling us exactly what was decided when. Now, I believe in the BBC, and I love the BBC, so I want the BBC to be successful. But let me, as an outsider now, let me try and explain what I think is going on here. And I think the clip you played, and I think Peter is right, the clip you played looks like it's sticking two things together which were not the same, and that therefore it's an edit that I personally would not have made on the evidence.
So you're not going to take my advice, and we'll come to that in a minute. You're going to deal with it now.
Well, I think
it's really important that we understand what the BBC is saying about this so-called report in the Daily Telegraph. That it is not a report; it is feedback. It's not an official report.
No, that's true. It is one individual advisor to the BBC who is dissenting from a line the BBC took. Now, the problem is we don't know, actually, what line the BBC took. So did the BBC look at this edit and decide it was okay? Or there is a defence you can possibly look at which says the programme as a whole was fair. And actually, contrary to what Peter was saying, Trump was whipping everything up on the 6th of January. So therefore, overall, it might have been fair. But the problem is we don't know because the BBC won't tell us what it decided and what the conclusions were.
And Ofcom has made a statement saying that they trust that the BBC will fully investigate these claims. Roger Bolton, the other Roger, is pushing us into analysing how these vignettes were put together in this 1-hour documentary by the BBC that is now under the microscope. 2 bits of Donald Trump's speech brought together in one edit. When you have a look at it, is it justifiable to do it that way?
No, it isn't, and they shouldn't have done it. But, of course, the overall programme was fair, and you must remember that the House of Representatives and then the Senate voted, and that included some Republicans saying that Trump had tried to subvert the election. And, of course, what you're dealing with here, basically, is Trump encouraging people to come to the Capitol, to flood the Capitol, in order to persuade, actually, I think, terrify representatives so that they actually say, well, the election wasn't fair. He's right. There was a big deal. And fortunately, the Vice President disagreed and went ahead with duty and said, as all courts have said subsequently, there was no substance to what Trump was saying. So the edit's wrong, I think, but the overall programme was fair. But what's going on here, and your listeners really into that, this is a hit job by the Daily Telegraph against the BBC.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
Well, let's hear the argument first, then you can come back. Roger.
There is a propagandist war going on here. The Daily Telegraph, in particular, has been attacked, and it keeps reprinting, for example, and following the people who are very much in favour of the Netanyahu government. And well, that's fine. It should do that, but people should be honest that that's what it's doing, and it has an interest in trying to frame the debate. And what the classic technique is, you take a small one incident, and the BBC does make mistakes, and you say that's representative of a wholesale bias across the corporation. That is totally. we're in a highly polarised society. Nobody seems to trust anybody. Everything seems to be black and white. You can't take a sort of pragmatic, sensible view of this. And it's very convenient to shoot the messenger. And this is what's going on. It doesn't mean that people shouldn't be more open. It should. It doesn't mean that people should make these mistakes. It shouldn't. It should mean that you should explain there's a propaganda war going on here. And in terms of this particular story,
all right. Roger, your line's breaking up. We'll just try and get that fixed. I want to bring Jonathan Sacerdoti in on this, who hasn't had a chance to speak yet. And Roger's point here seems to be, Jonathan, that in this BBC documentary, they were using vignettes in the documentary, but they were also trying to capture and to represent what actually happened on that day. And one can take from this documentary that what actually happened is that Donald Trump said, at one point, we're going to fight. And at another point, he said, we're going to walk down to the Capitol together. And these 2 points have been brought together.
Yeah, well, this is an old BBC trick. And just to jump in on what Roger was saying there, it's ridiculous. It's a propaganda war, he says, where the Daily Telegraph is somehow pointing out that the nation's broadcaster is doctoring speeches of the president of the US because it's part of a pro-Netanyahu agenda. My goodness, that sounds a little bit conspiratorial to me. What on earth has Donald Trump's speech on the 6th of January got to do with Benjamin Netanyahu? I would like to know. But let's be frank about this. Lots of different media organizations have an ideology or a slant, but only one of them is forcing people who own televisions or listen to iPlayer to give them their money. And you see, the Daily Telegraph may have a slant, but at least let's admit that the BBC has a massive slant. In fact, the BBC has for many years been a hard left at worst and sometimes left of centre propaganda station, especially on topics like Donald Trump, but not just on Donald Trump. The BBC, everybody knows this. You see, what's so strange about this Telegraph article is these Telegraph exposés. It's that this isn't a surprise to anyone. Most normal Britons who are watching the BBC or listening to the BBC, and that number's going down every day, are fully aware that the BBC, let's say on the environment, loves Greta Thunberg, hates skeptics about anthropogenic climate change. On Brexit, the BBC famously had something like a 2/3 skew towards Remain guests and experts on its flagship programmes like Question Time and Any Questions, when the country demonstrably was in favour of leaving in majority. On Israel, it is vastly skewed, as Roger pointed out there. And when it comes to Donald Trump, clearly the BBC hates Donald Trump. But you know what? Lots of people don't, and he's the President of the United States. So the BBC has a recurring problem. And when it comes to this dodgy editing that they did with the Trump speech, they did it also in that Hamas propaganda documentary where they had the child of the Hamas junior minister narrating the programme. They also had non-sequential editing in that, in which they pretended a whole sequence, a fantasy sequence of a sort of 9 or 10-year-old who was meant to be a paramedic. I mean, come off it. This child was said to be reacting on one particular day of the war, and yet his hair length changed and his shoes changed throughout the sequence. But they managed to try and make his T-shirt look the same in every shot, and they said in their own report that this had happened. Yeah. The BBC did the same to Her Late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. They tried to edit her so it looked like she had a tantrum at Annie Leibovitz during a photo shoot, and she didn't. The BBC loves this dodgy editing, and it knows exactly what it's doing, as it does on all of these other issues. It has an agenda, and it's doing it on our dime.
Roger Mosey, you don't speak for the BBC, but you are in that chair today as a former head of BBC News to at least help us understand. Those are mistakes that have been made.
Yes, but the idea that it's a conspiracy, and that's the BBC problem in a way, that the BBC should engage with these issues and be open and honest about what went wrong. The reason I think it's inhibited is because people use any issue as a reason to destroy the whole BBC. And we're speaking now on Radio Ulster, which I think is very good. I think Radio 4 is very good. I think most of the bulletins on TV are very good. And what you can't do is use an individual error to argue there's some sort of systemic bias in the whole of the BBC, which I just think doesn't stand up to examination. And even the Gaza documentary, it was a major error to have that child narrator. But the programme itself was worth making, and it revealed things about Gaza.
It was a fantasy. The whole programme was a fantasy.
No, it wasn't.
Well, there has been a BBC
programme-
investigation into it, and
both-
Peter
which
Johnson found
numerous
editorial failings
errors
in it.
For example, the one I just pointed out, the non-sequential editing, is detailed in that own BBC report. They misled the viewers into thinking that this child was acting as a paramedic on one day. They even put up
Jonathan,
a caption with
to
the
be
day
fair,
number.
if you read the BBC report by Peter Johnson, you'll find that the independent film company did not tell the BBC anything about this individual, this young child,
It
and their
took David
connections.
Collier, the investigative journalist, less than 12 hours after watching the programme to work this out on his own using open source information. You're telling me the BBC, with all its resources, didn't know this? It does say that the senior people in the production
company... It's undoubtedly a failing, yes.
But it's part of a pattern. It's a systemic failing that they make over and over again. When Jeremy Bowen said that Israel flattened the Al Ahly hospital, that was a failing, which he shrugged his shoulders and said, I don't regret. The BBC has a catalogue of failings. The Telegraph's revealed them. I've revealed them in my own investigative work on the BBC. Back in 2021, I was uncovering its calumnies about Israel in BBC Arabic. And the fact that they make these failings in Arabic and not in English shows they're not failings, they're ideological.
I'll tell you what, the hundreds of people who every weekend protest outside the building where I'm seated right now.
And they are also wrong. They're
protesting because they say the BBC is biased in favour of Israel. So we're getting this a lot.
So it's not managing to satisfy anyone.
Clearly not. But
trust
levels in BBC News, Roger Mosey, remain high.
Yes, because in the end, in a difficult world full of misinformation and disinformation, the BBC tries to get it right. And it sometimes makes mistakes, and it should be more accountable. But I've been on Talkback with you, William, in a debate about the Middle East in which both the Palestinian and the Israeli representatives said the BBC should be shut down.
Yeah.
And I think it's literally impossible to do coverage of the Middle East that doesn't antagonise one side.
Of course it's not. You could do responsible coverage that satisfies both sides.
Okay, we need to talk about what responsible coverage will look like.
And it doesn't work.
Peter Cardwell's trying to get back in. Peter, if you're in the BBC and you're covering Donald Trump in that Panorama programme and you're trying to tell people the truth, obviously, Donald Trump has lied more than any other politician in American history. Documented lies on the record. In that speech at the Eclipse, he was telling people that the election was rigged and he was the real president. He was trying to pressurize his own vice president into not completing the constitutional requirements for Joe Biden to take over. And he did say, we're going to fight in that speech. He did say, we're going to go up to the Capitol building.
He said fight when he was shot many years later, actually.
Well, he did, but I watched the... You can watch the speech. He said at the very end of the speech, he uses the fight terms. Let's play it. Let's play the fight terms at the end of the speech.
Because nobody until I came along had any idea how corrupt our elections were. And again, most people would stand there at 9 o'clock in the evening and say, I want to thank you very much. And they go off to some other life. But I said, something's wrong here. Something's really wrong. Can't have happened. And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
So that's what he says at the end of this long speech. He also says we're going to go to the Capitol and I'll go with you. He didn't, of course, go with them. And in this vignette, you have these two ideas brought together within a few seconds in this 1-hour documentary. Now, Peter, the question is, does that documentary represent what happened accurately on that day? Clearly not sequentially, but does it give you the story in general terms of what happened on that day?
None of that matters, William.
It does
Basically,
matter.
It doesn't matter.
It does matter.
Well, let me tell you why. So Roger said earlier, the overall programme was fair, right? 99% of the programme may have been fair, but what matters is the 1% that wasn't fair, that was made up and was spliced together from what Michael Prescott says. And his report is very significant. It may not be an official report. Doesn't matter. He went to the head of BBC News. He went to the chairman of the BBC. It
matters if you're misrepresenting it as an official report.
Well, who cares? The point
Clearly
is...
the Daily Telegraph care.
Well, the Daily Telegraph can report what they want, but the fact is that numerous parliamentarians, and your programme is not being influenced by the Daily Telegraph, okay? They're reporting what someone very senior had put to BBC managers and nothing was done. You talked about the Gaza documentary. You said there was a report into that and there were editorial failings. How many people have been sacked? How many senior people have been sacked? In BBC Northern Ireland, when I worked there, if there was a clip from the Assembly, let's say it was someone from the Assembly, an MLA, and I had spliced something together to change the meaning of what they said and broadcast it on BBC Radio Ulster, rightly, I would have lost my job. Rightly, that would have happened. You mentioned Peter Johnson there, and you mentioned the reports he's done into many things, the former head of BBC Northern Ireland. In my strongly held personal view, he was a dreadful head of BBC Northern Ireland.
Oh, come
He's
on.
a weak person. No, he was. And the fact is that these reports are not nearly strong enough, and the fact that people have not lost their job on the Gaza documentary, and the fact that the head of Panorama has not been suspended is ridiculous, because in any other organisation, in any other broadcaster, this would have happened by now, and you know that.
Roger Bolton, do you think some heads or deputy heads need the role here?
Well, the problem... Well, look, I've said I think the editing of that particular sequence was wrong, but the programme overall was fair. We would need to know more about it in the background. But the fundamental problem here is that they, in a highly... where propaganda is going on all the time, each side accusing the BBC, they're seizing on any small detail and then generalising to allege a sort of widespread BBC conspiracy.
Yeah.
Anybody who's worked in the BBC knows that's not true. It's not even possible.
They couldn't organise a conspiracy if they tried.
It couldn't, and it's not possible. And, you know, when you look, and I'm sorry I raised the thing about Telegraph in one way, but it is true that they are the constant focusing on details that are going wrong in the BBC. It's a large organisation, and then magnifying that into a conspiracy against Israel or conspiracy against the Conservative Party, whatever. It's entirely true. It says something about our society now, where we are so polarised that we won't listen to each other. We don't believe there's a role for an organisation to try and establish the facts. We leap on every small detail which we disagree with and say, it shows you, doesn't it? There's a conspiracy against you. There may be cock-up, and the BBC is not bad at cock-ups. There is no conspiracy. What the BBC needs to do, and it is at fault in this way, and I agree with Roger, my namesake, is it needs to publish the details. It's obviously considered this document. It's decided, apparently, not to take action, the sort of action the author of the document wants. Well, it should put that out in the open. But what we don't need is politicians who are fed partial stories by newspapers immediately calling for resignation, something on the whole they don't do themselves. And, you know, it's a convenient way of dodging the problems here.
And again, I emphasise, the BBC says this document constituted essentially unsolicited feedback. It's not an official report by any committee of the BBC. So the idea it's been leaked as a report is being challenged.
Can I just say one thing? The BBC was very keen, under the Conservative government, and I think it was right to do so, to get a wider range of views on the editorial standards board, so that, you know, to stop the danger of a single view developing. The author of this particular report has connections with the Conservative Party, did work for the Conservative government, is a public relations expert, and before that was a journalist on the Sunday Times.
Political editor of the Sunday Times.
That's fine. But everybody should know that. And he's coming from a particular perspective. Now, what the BBC needs to do is say, what did they do? Did they discuss that report? If they did, what action did they take and why?
Well, this is the problem that we face, because we reach out to the BBC, they give you a 1-sentence or 2-sentence statement. They don't put anybody on your show, on a BBC programme, to defend the situation that they're writing about in their 1 or 2 sentences, and we're all left
can't do that
floundering.
Anymore.
It's ridiculous.
May I just say,
yes, please,
you say that this guy represents one opinion, and of course he does. Everyone represents one opinion.
Well, I'm quoting the BBC in saying that, yeah.
But the BBC never represents that man's opinion, and that man's opinion is held by a vast portion of this country, and that's the point. And to say that it's, you know, the Daily Telegraph or other outlets are attacking the BBC because of their own political skew, that may be true. Of course it may be true. But again, I reiterate, it is utter denial about the BBC's own part in that
But Jonathan,
game.
you're alleging the BBC's bias because it's standing up for the consensus position on science on climate change.
I'm sorry, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the BBC is biased because on a number of issues, it claims there is a consensus. What about Brexit? It was literally 2/3 to 1/3 across, and it wasn't one-offs. It was across analysis of all of the episodes.
Well, what about the Remainers who said that Brexit wouldn't have happened if the BBC hadn't given a daily platform to Nigel Farage month after month?
Let's get into the fantasy of what might or might not have happened. What we do know is that the majority of the electorate who voted to leave, and despite the BBC having spent the entire campaign period, putting on 2/3 to 1/3 approximately
That's
guests
not
on the
true,
other side.
Jonathan. During the referendum campaign...
What do you mean one at a time?
true.
I've got to go to two Rogers. Roger Mosey first, then Roger Bolton.
Yeah, during the referendum campaign, the coverage was absolutely 50-50. The period you're talking about, yes, it was. It's objectively 50-50. That was demonstrably the case. In the rest of the time, in the lead up to the referendum and possibly after it, if you represent parliamentary opinion, something like 3/4 or more of Parliament's MPs will remain. So therefore, if you count it that way round, well, yes, if the BBC reflected Parliament, it had a leaning towards reform in the people put on air. But it's not a conspiracy. The BBC was not anti-Brexit, and there are plenty of people who say,
no,
as
it's
William just
groupthink.
said,
It doesn't have to be
Farage had too much
conspiracy.
coverage.
It's a form of groupthink because the BBC literally encapsulates a form of groupthink. An analysis by the Institute of Economic Affairs found that across two BBC flagship shows, BBC Question Time and Any Questions, from June December 2017, panellists supporting Remain was 68% versus 32% for Leave. So it's not wrong.
So
You're
probably
wrong.
MPs.
Sorry. Could I just say on that? First of all, let's be clear. The Institute of Economic Affairs is a right-wing pro-Brexit organisation. Let's also say the electorate also...
And the BBC isn't left-wing. I mean, it's very
let's also
convenient that you can say that.
Let's also point out that the vote was the vote was very close, and the majority of the electorate, as opposed to those who voted, did not vote in favour of Brexit, but that's a separate matter. It's just a fact that we put into the discussion.
All right. Peter Cardwell, I know you've got to go. I'm also conscious that you took a swipe at somebody who's not here in the room, as it were, Peter Johnson, who used to be our boss here and controller and director of BBC Northern Ireland. Incidentally, if we're talking about Peter Johnson, he was one of the most significant and creative BBC leaders I've ever worked with, Peter. And I worked with him a lot. So let's just put that on the record too.
Well, that's fine. You're entitled to your opinion just as I am. And I think in terms of how he dealt with a number of scandals, he was weak. That is my personally held view. And others will have different views. That's absolutely fine. In regard
how many minutes were you actually in a room with him?
Far fewer than you,
yeah.
But I can see what he did, and I can see the actions. I can see the result of his actions.
But that's what happens. You were probably in a meeting with him once, if that, and that you go on a live radio show and assault the man's reputation.
William, I've given my opinion. I'm not sort of saying that I'm going to say any more about it necessarily, unless you want me to.
No,
but I can see the results.
I'm just saying it's rather typical of a certain kind of logical style of argumentation. Take a tiny point and enlarge it.
Okay, so there are two things that I would say about what Peter Johnson has done. Let's take a look at the result of his actions. And this is my view. This is my personal view.
We're not here to have a deep dive into Peter Johnson.
Well, you just brought it up again.
No, you had a go at him, and I thought it was reasonable to put it on the record that many people disagree with you.
Do you want me to talk about Peter Johnson, or do you not?
No, I'm happy for you to talk about what we're here to talk about, which is whether the BBC has lost trust from the public on the basis of a few vignettes in a documentary on the eve of the last American election, where they presented a narrative of Donald Trump standing on the ellipse in which he used rather wild language at times. And most people in America would agree with that. Most people who don't support Donald Trump perhaps would agree with that. Certainly those courts that convicted those who went to the Capitol might agree with that.
Let me go back to my original point. My original point is, if you don't have trust in broadcasting, you don't have anything. If people don't trust the words that are coming out of your mouth, talkback fails. If people don't trust the words that are coming out of my mouth, my show fails. And the fact is that it doesn't matter that 99% of that panorama was probably fine. It matters that they faked something or allegedly faked something, and I've seen the evidence, and you've probably seen the evidence too. It matters that the BBC is a huge organisation, but it matters how they deal with things. It matters how they deal with Russell Brand, for example. It matters that report took 18 months to 2 years, and that is something that Peter Johnson did, for example. It matters that Greg Wallace was covered up for a number of years by managers. And if you don't have that trust, you don't have anything. I'm not interested in making personal attacks on people, okay? I give my opinion on Peter Johnson. You've defended him. That's fine. Yeah. The point is that there are very senior people.
And we'll still have lunch next time you're here.
That's fine. There are very senior people in the BBC whose job it is to safeguard the trust, to take serious people like Michael Prescott, whether it's an official report or not, I don't care. The point is, if a senior person makes allegations, that has to be treated very, very properly.
Should be.
And diligently. And the point is, the final point is that if that is then rubbished, if that is put to the back of the queue, if that is then not dealt with properly by people like Deborah Turness, who's the head of BBC News, or people like Samar Shah, who's the chairman, and then it comes out elsewhere, and then the BBC puts out a one-line statement saying we take allegations very seriously. Well, clearly they didn't, and clearly they haven't been for many years, and clearly trust is something which is in crisis at the BBC, and it's going to continue to be until they change their culture.
Crisis, thank you very much, Peter. I know you got to go. You've got to do another show. Crisis language is very interesting. Is there a crisis within the BBC? Johnny is in Belfast. Hi, Johnny.
Hi, William. Look, there's no doubt that the BBC have questions to answer for over the Panorama documentary and the way they spliced it together. But what I would say is I would trust the BBC over any other media organisation with regards news and current affairs. I think, and I really believe, there's almost like a right-wing agenda from the likes of, I think, that gentleman called Jonathan, and the likes of Boris Johnson to continually ebb away at the BBC. Now, I think, what's the licence fee? 170, 175 quid a year. Personally, by the way, I've said it before, I would pay it for Radio 4, I'd pay it for Radio Ulster and 5 Live. I think it makes me culturally a better human than any right-wing press or media or talk shows.
Don't be going too far. Don't be going too far. You were doing all right there for a minute.
I don't want to sound like an apologist for the BBC, because sometimes the woke and the BBC kind of slightly irks me. But listen, the BBC give me Jonathan Pie, okay? It give me Jonathan Pie. I mean, it is intellectual, it's funny, it's cutting. And there's a great episode on Brexit, which is ironic because we ended up talking about Brexit in this show today because of your man bringing up Brexit. Well, that's over. It's done with. But listen, don't leave the BBC alone, okay?
We can't leave the BBC alone. People are paying for it. They're entitled to raise their concerns about it.
Exactly. You could pay for it as a subscriber if you've got such enormous trust in it and like giving your 170 quid. That is exactly my point. I don't want to ban the BBC. I want to stop it ripping off the country. I want it to rely on the great trust.
They're not ripping off the country. I'm sorry.
You could pay for it.
They're not ripping off the country. No, they're not ripping off the country. It represents great value and is much more trustworthy than anything you're probably representing today.
Like it shouldn't have to pay for it. You don't need to be rude about other opinions. That's the point. The BBC
whoa. The BBC is the British Broadcasting Corporation. It's there for everybody, by the way, okay? And yes, they're going to make mistakes.
Except for all the people that see through its biases and through its calumnies. Get over yourself.
That's patronising and condescending. Come on, you're better than that.
No, it's not. It's not. You could tell me I'm patronising and condescending, or you could actually engage with the many substantive points that have been made on this.
Come on, Johnny.
I'm not disingenuous at all.
Johnny, he's making an argument. He's making an argument against the licence fee.
You don't know me. You obviously don't know.
Yeah, but the licence fee is fine.
But just to shout at me and tell me that I'm
disingenuous
and patronising, I think reflects very badly on you. Why don't you discuss the issue of whether it should be paid for by subscription?
How dare you come on here with your English?
Johnny, thank you. We're going to finish with Johnny there. Thank you very much. You're absolutely free to make an argument against licence fee funding for the BBC. You're absolutely free to make an argument
on the BBC,
that we should be
great.
Exactly. You're absolutely free to do that and to say I prefer a subscription model or a voluntary model, whatever.
It makes me patronising and disingenuous and far right wing.
It clearly doesn't. It clearly doesn't.
Of course it doesn't. I know, but I'm just saying that this is the problem: is that when you try and discuss something like the BBC's funding pattern, you get these people who consider it like a sort of religion or a holy cow, like the NHS. Any criticism of it is deemed, especially from within the BBC, sometimes is deemed to be, absolutely unacceptable. Of course, we ought to be able to talk about that. Why shouldn't we?
I will just say, if there's ever a quote-unquote crisis or scandal or failing involving the BBC, turn on the BBC. You will get constant coverage of it on the BBC.
And like you said, the BBC wouldn't give you someone to comment, so you get coverage, but they won't comment on their own show about their own failings.
And you'll get me as a presenter calling them out as I would a government department or a government agency, saying, stick somebody on the programme, be transparent. We're paying your wages. Let's hear your defence. John's in Belfast. Hey, John.
Hi, William. Well, it's good to hear from the man from the sailing Daily Telegraph, as Donald Trump might say. But I think he's been quite clearly he's come out and says what this is really about. It's an attack on public broadcasting. I don't work for the Daily Telegraph.
If you talk about Jonathan, he works for the Spectator, amongst other things.
Oh, well, okay, right. the marginal Spectator then.
Oh, come on.
The oldest magazine in the world,
the point I'm making is this is an attack on public broadcasting. And people should, at the beginning of the conversation, the gentleman should say, look, I don't believe in the concept even of the BBC. And the other thing is, these people from the Daily Telegraph and Talk, that gentleman Peter from Talk, they're all competitors for the BBC. So what they see is the BBC taking such a lion's share of the broadcast viewers and all the rest of it, and so they just really, it's an attack on their competitor. So
GB News is doing very well in terms of its audiences, you know.
Yeah, but it's still, compared to the BBC, it's a peak script. It's not really. It's very, very.
No, they don't like the content, but the rating is doing very well.
The ratings are higher.
Yes, well, relative to the BBC, it is not doing well, and that's the essence of it. They all look at the BBC.
GB News ranks higher than BBC News.
Pardon?
GB News frequently rates higher than BBC News.
Yeah, well, on what metric is that? I mean,
audience figures.
On the viewer figures.
And the other thing about it is this is the essence.
You just
of
move
it.
on from that.
When somebody comes on this radio program, William, to attack the BBC, the thing they should declare is that we are from another competitor media outlet, and that
no, I'm frank about that. But it's a competitor outlet that funds itself commercially and doesn't rely on taking money from people that don't
I believe in public broadcasting, and I will not defer from that. Public broadcasting has made such a contribution, and I would be critical of BBC sometimes. But no, I think that it's important. It's more fundamental. And the reason why there's so many problems in America, and I lived in America for 7 years, is there's no public broadcasting, and people are getting their news through a filter of billionaires.
PBS was
who really inform
Donald
people.
Trump has defunded PBS.
I know he has now, but when this chap lived there 7 years, I don't know.
PBS
he's shutting it down.
PBS's budget was minuscule, and I worked for public broadcasting
more money.
for a while.
Got it.
And so what you have really when these people come on and they talk about all the issues about Gaza and they talk about other broadcast things, they really should be saying, I start off from the position that I want public broadcasting to end and then go on from there.
No, I want truth. That's what I want. I want the public broadcaster
you don't want the truth.
You want
it
to be able to do so from the luxury of having this funding. It could actually pursue truth, even when it's unpopular. Right. So making a documentary about children in Gaza, it could have looked at the way that Hamas and the Palestinian terror organisations abuse children and manipulate them to put out a propaganda message like they did in that documentary. But instead of doing that, they put out this fantasy that could have been scripted by Hamas itself. A Hamas minister's son was put on air.
Guys, can't hear you. You're both talking at the same time. John,
the Israeli army is the main terrorists in the Middle East.
John, we're going to have to say goodbye, but thank you very much. Very forceful interventions there from John in Belfast. Roger Mosey, let me just come back. I think the BBC would want me to point out that that GB News ratings at certain parts of the day beat the BBC News channel, but not the overall BBC output. Obviously, that's the comparison being made there. But every news organisation, Roger, every news organisation makes mistakes, has failings, has flaws, sometimes has to sack people, everyone. But when it comes to the BBC, do you get the impression that when a flaw or a mistake is exposed, the argument then becomes, let's shut the whole thing down? We don't tend to do that with a newspaper when they get it wrong.
No, and look, William, I think two things are true. Number one is there are some people who use any single mistake on the BBC to try to destroy the whole organisation and want to shut it down. And that's either for commercial or ideological or perfectly conscientiously held beliefs that they don't like public broadcasting.
Yeah.
Then the second thing is the one that you've touched on and the other Roger touched on, which is that actually the BBC should be having this dialogue. And I don't understand why they're not. And if you're a truly transparent public service organisation, you should be having a conversation, explaining what goes wrong and explaining what goes right. And the BBC at the moment is not doing that. And I think they're therefore allowing this open goal from the people who want to destroy them because they're not currently giving a detailed rebuttal. So I am puzzled by that. I'm upset by that. But ultimately, public service broadcasting is worth fighting for all the reasons John said. If we lost it, we'd be much the poorer as a nation.
Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it. Roger Mosey, Roger Bolton, Jonathan Sacerdoti and Peter Cardwell.